for increasing energy access in humanitarian contexts. It is 3 o'clock. We do have a very tight agenda, so we'll start on time as we go forward. So today's session is hosted by Humanitarian, the global platform for action on sustainable energy in displacement settings, for which I'm the operational lead. And today we will be featuring presentations from Mercy Corps, IOM, Practical Action, and Energy Peace Partners. Amy, if you can just go on to the next slide, please. And then the following, if that's okay. And today, we just want to talk about the blended finance topic and market-based approaches, as they're becoming increasingly of interest to practitioners, as well as because traditional funding mechanisms are not resulting in the sustainable solutions that we envisage. In other words, when the funding runs out, the project seems to come to a halt. But before we actually start and go into the presentations, I would like to highlight 2 relatively new reports on the topic. And my colleague will drop links in the chat box for you to download. The first is called An Assessment of Market-Driven Solutions for Energy Access in Refugee Settlements in Sub-Saharan Africa. And this was produced by the Smart Communities Coalition. The second was produced by NORCAP and the GPA, and it's on blended finance solutions for clean energy in humanitarian settings. And that's the one that I'd like to talk through very briefly at the beginning of this introduction of the next 3 slides. And please do refer to these reports for further information, because the overview I'm going to give is very quick and high level. First off, what do we mean by blended finance? And I think the first thing we need to make sure is that we don't confuse it with innovative finance, which is a much broader definition, while blended finance has a very sort of clear definition. And essentially, and you can press next, actually the next 2. Essentially what blended finance is to use humanitarian funding to attract additional finance into a project. And the project itself must drive some form of humanitarian, social, environmental, or development progress. And thirdly, there must be some sort of financial return to the private sector. So that's what we mean by blended finance. And I say there's a whole section on that in the report if you'd like to know more. Amy, next slide. There are 4 types of blended finance solutions. The first one is direct funding. And this is where funding in terms of a grant can actually remove a commercial barrier and let a commercial business model take over and drive forward. And this, for instance, could be where cooking gas can't be accessed by the end user because of the actual cost of the stove, the initial cylinder, and the regulator. The second one is the provision of technical assistance, which really addresses knowledge gaps and makes projects more investable by reducing the risks and uncertainties through that. The third one is around risk transfer mechanisms, where financial risks are transferred to third parties. And this can normally takes the form of some kind of guarantee. And the last one is market incentives, and they actually use to create markets where they don't normally exist. And one of the examples here is results-based financing. Amy, next slide. And really the key sort of summary from the report is that there's a lot of interest in this topic, but the experience is quite limited. So hence today, where we're going to explore some examples. And where we have seen success, it hasn't really translated into scale up and transformative change. Again, that's why we'd like to promote good examples so that people can get ideas and to take these elsewhere. We also note that there's a lot of challenges around blended finance, especially with regard to integrating the end user and local businesses into the design of blended finance solutions. And that is, and one of the other things is that actually blended finance might need to be further with other options, in the sense that blended finance can sort of look at the supply side, where we need some demand side finance to make it more affordable. So that is a very, very quick overview, and hopefully I haven't lost too many people in providing in that summary, but please, as I say, go to the report, download it and have a quick read through. And now I'd like to get into the meat of today's presentation. So I'd like to introduce Cecilia Ragazzi, Director of Energy Access at Mercy Corps, who will look at market-based solutions for cooking in Niger and green electrification in Ethiopia. So Cecilia, over to you.
Hi, Cecilia, we cannot hear you.
Better now?
Yes.
Yeah, all right, okay. Sorry if you hear some pings as notifications. So as Marco was saying, my name is Cecilia Ragazzi. I'm based in Scotland and I'm a Mercy Corps Director for Access to Energy. And in this position, I lead the global strategy for access to energy within the organization. If you can move to the next one, Amy, thanks. So Mercy Corps operates in 42 countries and through a variety of multi-sectoral programs. In September 21, we merged with Energy for Impact, and this to add deep technical energy knowledge to our operations. The merger aspires to work at a global level, but we are taking a phased approach, focusing on Africa first. So there are 3 underpinning principles to our energy access strategy. The first one is community energy services. And with this, we mean that Mercy Corps works directly with communities to ensure that access to energy is available across diverse user groups. The second principle is to harness private sector partnerships. And our experience has proven that acting in partnership with the private sector actors is essential to making market system work better for the poor. And this also for energy access. And finally, utilizing innovative financing solutions, which is really the topic of today. And we are aware that economic barriers linked to the wider uptake of quality energy technologies are really defined by this. So we address such barriers both on the supply and the demand side, mostly through blended financing. If you can move to the next one, please. So our intervention in the humanitarian energy approach builds on these 3 principles as well. And these allow us to reach impactful, sustainable, quality and scalable programming. So through blended finance and partnership with the private sector, we combine different types of financing with an underpinning humanitarian mandate. The final goal is to improve displaced and host populations' quality of life and increase their opportunities to have steady revenue streams that in turn would improve their capacity to satisfy their energy needs through quality products and services. So at Mercy Corps, we're increasingly design energy programs with the 3 value drives in mind. Scale, as we treat concessional grants as a catalytic instrument to attract commercial finance into projects. Impact, energy access is a necessary but yet not sufficient condition to improve livelihoods, food security and resilience. It is true that the displaced communities need power, but this is not enough if it's not supported by a conducive environment, which includes financial instruments, appliances, and markets. And this calls for the 3rd principle, which is partnerships. To achieve changes at scale, it is necessary to bring together and leverage on mutual expertise coming from the humanitarian actors, public institutions, and the private sector. Through these partnerships, we needed to consider different points of view and opportunities to create viable markets, regulation opportunities. So today I would like to introduce you to 2 projects that saw direct financial investment from private companies. One is on clean cooking in Niger and one is on electrification in Ethiopia. And the next slides introduce you to Aleri, which is a 2-year project supported by BPRM, which is the humanitarian branch of USAID. It's implemented in Niger, and Aleri aims to increase livelihood opportunities for our refugees and host communities, while also introducing the option of cooking with LPG in 3 refugee camps in the Maradi region, impacting more than 40,000 people. The government of Niger is supporting the integration into the society of 500,000 displaced people in the country, while seeking a balance in the use of natural resources with the host communities. Indeed, in Maradi, displaced and host communities have similar cooking needs. we found that 95% of households use 3 stone fires, while 5% of them use ceramic stoves, spending averagely $3 per week on wood fuel and charcoal for cooking. This has resulted in the complete depletion of the surrounding natural resources, a source of increased tensions between communities. And in parallel, women and children are increasingly exposed to violence as they need to travel further to collect biomass, about 5 hours per week. In our assessment, 100% of the respondents said that they would like to switch to modern cooking, such as LPG, as it's fast, suitable even in the rainy season, and maintains the place clean. However, we also discovered that the acquisition of the startup kit, which is basically the refillable gas cylinder, the cooker and the cooker base, and the lack of refilling points nearby were considered the main barriers to this switch. We conducted several rounds of consultations, including with UNHCR, walked this road in another region of Niger, and we decided to engage with LPG companies to assess their barriers to market entry. We discovered that we could act as a bridge, removing the single biggest obstacle for the technology uptake, which was the starter kit. And to support the shift, we also distributed a voucher worth for 6 months of refills for the most vulnerable households. However, we also wanted our LPG partner company that we selected through a tender to have a skin in the game, so that to ensure that the services that they were offering were there to stay and had quality standards. The direct financial investment in the project was indeed one of the requisites for the tender. The LPG company is now breaking ground to build an LPG depot and 3 refilling stations, while the livelihood activities, some of them are actually on the LPG value chain, already started providing refugees with increased income. The next slide introduces you to the second project, which is called Enter Energy in Ethiopia. So there are 4.7 million forcibly displaced people in Ethiopia, and it's estimated that less than 7% of them have access to energy. Again, we know that ensuring access to energy for all, including refugees and other hosts, require changes that are beyond the capacity of individual organizations, companies, or institutional actors. Mercy Corps and Shell have been collaborating for more than 3 years to provide vulnerable communities with access to energy in a sustainable way. Enter Energy in Ethiopia is the fruit of this collaboration. It's implemented in the Sheder camp in the Somali region of Ethiopia, and it has 2 main objectives. The first one is to create a replicable, sustainable, market-based program that provides clean, sustainable, and affordable energy services in humanitarian settings. Then to improve the enabling environment that allows the power of energy access to fulfill its catalytic role, working on expanding financial services and livelihood opportunities, always in line with the national regulations. The next slide, please. No, it's beautiful, but it's not that one. Perfect, yes. Mercy Corps conducted in-depth energy market research in Ethiopia while designing Enter Energy, and decided to fill a clear gap on the supply side for humanitarian energy. We decided to set up Humanitarian Energy PLC, Human in short, which is a limited liability company of which Mercy Corps is majority shareholder in joint venture with a national for-profit engineering company, Rensis. Through Human, which operates on a commercial basis with a clear humanitarian mandate, we aim to test, refine, and establish a sustainable energy access model for displacement settings. This powers households and productive activities among refugees and host communities, as well as humanitarian agencies' offices, compounds, and operations through an energy as a service model, removing the need for direct capital investment from the clients. Enter Energy in Ethiopia represents the paradigm of our approach to blended finance. We leveraged a grant from Shell to create a favorable environment where the business's model could thrive, which in turn attracted direct financial investments from our minority partner, Rensis. We created a business model that reinvests the profits at the net of operation and maintenance costs into electrification of other camps while attracting additional capital. And we are also exploring the option of generating carbon credits through the portfolio of projects in the pipeline. Next one. So I hope that this quick run through our humanitarian energy projects gave you a sense of our approach and the direction that we're walking. And I'm eager to learn more from my colleagues in this panel and looking forward to the discussion with today's participants. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Cecilia. Thanks for giving such a good overview of the two projects there. As is seen in the chat, if you do have any questions, please do drop them in the chat box and we'll pick them up in the discussion section later. But now I'd like to hand over to Laura Clark, the Programme Manager for RE4R Project Practical Action, who will discuss blended finance as a means for improving household energy access in Rwanda. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I'm going to focus on the Rwanda component of the project. I'm really looking at the household energy access part of that. So I'll give a quick introduction to the project and then get straight into it. And there's a color code on the slide. So the green boxes are the sort of key takeaways from each slide. So if you only read one bit, read the bit in green. That's the sort of color code to the presentation. So quick overview of RE4R. It's been delivered in a partnership between Practical Action and UNHCR. It's just coming to the end of the project now. It's been working in 3 refugee camps in Rwanda where the levels of energy access at the start of the project were very low. And we've implemented a range of energy interventions in those 3 camps, focusing on energy access for households, livelihoods, and communities. And for this project, for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the solar home systems and the household energy access component. But I just wanted to highlight that this is within a much wider set of interventions, really looking at providing that total energy access, trying to use market-based approaches to strengthen and support local markets across the energy landscape. And really one of the key components of making that market-based approach successful is looking at the system as a whole and trying to address those constraints and cross-cutting themes that affect all those elements of energy access. So if I can move on to the next slide. For this particular component, looking at the solar home systems, we really tried to upfront look at what the market constraints were, what was inhibiting private sector suppliers, what was inhibiting the supply of household energy access. And we really tried to identify the following market constraints. And what we were trying to do was use funding from the project alongside practical action investment and alongside the purchasing power of the refugees themselves to really try and unlock that market system, trying to make sure that the market was strengthened, sustainable, through working by those local actors, be that private sector, government, UNHCR and their implementing partners in the camp, refugee committees and the refugees themselves, to really try and strengthen that market, to make sure that we were ensuring the long-term financial sustainability of investments from all sides and really trying to make that market strengthened and sustainable. And the key takeaway I wanted to highlight here was that there are multiple constraints that need to be addressed. The sort of headings on the slide there are just a sort of snapshot of the main themes of the constraints that we identified and wanted to address. Some of those could be addressed by private sector, but some of them needed to be addressed by other actors in the system. And they're of course interlinked and dynamic, and that stakeholder engagement with all of those implementing partners, getting them engaged, getting them to buy into the concept, getting them to be participants, and engaged in the whole process is really important, and may include the use of finance mechanisms for other market actors, not just the suppliers themselves. And for example, in terms of demand perception, of course, the suppliers that we work with did their own marketing, but we also engage with a community mobilization partner to really improve awareness of renewable energy more generally and make sure that customers and participants and other stakeholders were making informed choices and knew about the renewable energy products and services that were available more widely. I can move on to the next slide. So to engage with the private sector, we really had to use a non-standard procurement type of process. And I've just contrasted the procurement process that we went through for the street lights in the camps, which was a much more standard procurement process, to the engagement that we went through with the private sector for the solar home systems. And some of it was similar. We went through a competitive process to select the suppliers that were interested in entering this space. We shared our goals and what we were trying to achieve from the intervention. And then we worked with those suppliers through a much more iterative process and through a sort of selection and partnership engagement process to be able to provide a package of financial, technical and facilitation support, some of those key themes that Mark mentioned in his introduction, to overcome the specific barriers identified by each supplier, and also to help them really integrate the intervention aims into their business model. So in the end, we selected 2 suppliers to try and reach a range of the market, a range of customers in the market, and to be able to provide choice to refugees with their differentiated products, prices and payment models. As you can see, we went through this process to get them on board. Actually, when it came to the reality of engaging with the private sector, although we sort of shared a lot of information, we did a lot of outreach, there were only a few applicants that proposed a business model that we thought was really likely to reach particularly the lower income households. And actually there was a limited choice of suppliers who were willing to deviate from that standard procure and distribute model, or that standard procurement model, who were interested in coming up with this different way of financing and setting up this sustainable business model. And it was quite a challenge going through that process for us to have this mutual understanding of the balance of risks and investments through that partnership process. Key takeaway from that is the process that we went through and that engagement that we went through and getting that buy-in and getting the right partners on board really required relationship building, openness, information sharing, and capacity building on both sides. It wasn't a standard procurement process that we went through. If I can move on to the next slide. So some examples of the kind of financial support and the way that we use the finance with the suppliers. For example, one of the suppliers wanted to establish a revolving fund to provide access to loans and savings, a group loans and savings schools for their low income customers in the camp, so that they could engage in income generating activities, earn a bit more money, repay the loans, and then afford the monthly solar home systems payments. So for this component, we provided an element of seed capital. Then the participants repaid those loans and engaged in the loans and savings schemes. And then Bellicom themselves, as this was integrated into their operating model, also invested in their staff and invested in setting up and establishing those groups as part of their overall customer services. Another example from Bellicom, they didn't have a presence in the camp before the camps. They had a presence in other parts of Rwanda for different parts of their business model, but part of their offering was to really have that face-to-face contact in the camps. And as a result, they wanted to construct a shop, a retail outlet in each camp. One of the things we did was co-invest in that shop to allow them to get that footprint early on in their camp, early on in their implementation, to be able to establish that footprint, provide a base for their staff, provide their stock in camp, and really start them going and setting up their business. So we co-invested in that retail outlet. The other supplier that we partnered with was Bbox in particular, had a more expensive product, and they wanted to provide an initial subsidy to reduce the initial cost of their products, to accustom their refugee customers in particular to the ongoing financial commitment of their energy service fee. So after the initial 3 years, those customers would be well accustomed to affording that monthly payment and would be able to continue to be Bbox customers in the long term. So those are a few of the examples of the kind of finance mechanisms and the kind of things that we provided funding for, and we got the suppliers to also engage with, as well as part of providing their business models, a part of extending their business models to customers in and around the camps. And that supplier management process, as we went through the implementation, relied on a mix of milestones, targets, incentives, and behavior change as well. And this was quite different, again, to a kind of standard contractual obligation or performance guarantees. It was a real mixed process. And again, that facilitation process take time, needed to be adaptive, and took resources and expertise to get that to work and adapt to the dynamic market conditions that we experienced in the camps. I can move on to the next one. So in terms of what was achieved, Bbox and Bellicom, the two suppliers that we engaged with for their provision of solar home systems, provided quite a different offering into the camps, different price point, different capacity, different appliances, and a really different approach to their after-sales support and customer engagement. But overall, at the end of the project, we had over 4,000 solar home systems installed, which represented camp access of more than 50% of refugee households in the camp now have tier 1 electricity access provided by their solar home systems. We have over 700 participants in that group loans and savings scheme in the revolving funds. So really trying to make sure that those solar home systems are accessible to the lower income households within the camps. We've got around 79 to 80% of customers are on time with their monthly payments for the solar home systems. And we've really seen a shift in behavior whereby over 90% of those customers use the solar home system as their primary source of lighting. We recently completed a final evaluation of the project, and the main points that the evaluation found in terms of this intervention in particular and the work with the solar home system suppliers was the partnerships and the arrangement we really set up with those two solar home system suppliers really focused on reducing the entry barriers for those suppliers to enter the camp. It supported the market-based uptake of solar home systems and through those appropriate financial mechanisms and approaches to address affordability. The training and awareness that we did of renewable energy products supported the uptake. However, what we did find was there was still some financial barriers remaining for some sectors of the community, some vulnerable groups, and as a result, we adopted a separate inclusivity strategy to provide additional support to those most vulnerable groups. In terms of our recommendations from that experience and some sort of key takeaways, there's no code on this one. This one should be all green because these are our key takeaways from the overall presentation. Balancing that co-investment and that risk profile, the market conditions in the camps are challenging, and building that commitment with the private sector partner in particular is really key. That relies on building trust, a mutual understanding, and allowing both sides of the partnership to share information openly very early in the engagement process. And it's very important to be able to assess supplier risks and their willingness to work in those markets. And it takes time and resource to really engage and do that in an open and constructive way. Financing inclusivity, although we've demonstrated that some viable models are applicable for some segments, others have not been reached, and we've had to adopt a specific inclusivity strategy. And really important in terms of engaging with the private sector is building that shared vision for the long term, not just focusing on the initial sales, but making sure that the finance mechanisms are structured to incentivize those longer term commitments, continued customer satisfaction, repair rates, and flexible repayment models. So really important to have that shared vision to make sure that your investments are sustainable and lead to the outcomes that you want for your target populations. That's the key takeaways. I've rushed through that, and I'm sure we'll dive into more detail in the Q&A later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for sharing those learnings of a very interesting project. I can see some questions going in the chat. Please do put some more. We'll pick those up later with the presenters. Now I'd like to hand over to Eva Mark, Head of Environmental Sustainability at IOM, and Linda Wamoon, Program Director at Energy Peace Partners, who will be talking about the use of renewable energy credits in Malakal, South Sudan. Eva, I believe you are up first. Over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Mark, and thank you for the whole GPA team for bringing all of us together. It's a wonderful opportunity to exchange, and congratulations to colleagues at Mercy Corp and Practical Action, UNHCR, for all the results that you just presented. After listening to Cecilia and Laura, you might wonder why focusing on greening humanitarian infrastructure is relevant to all this discussion around energy access for communities, especially in humanitarian and displacement context. So I would just like to start with two UN-related statistics before we look at the case study. The UN has more than 315,000 personnel worldwide, and IOM alone, for example, has 20,000 in more than 500 offices. So it's a massive scale. And the UN actually procures more than $22 billion a year. It's a collective amount, but construction is one of the largest sectors for procurement. So due to the physical scale of the UN and the ability to engage and of course influence the market with such scale, we can really not talk about the clean energy transition at scale in displacement settings without considering our own premises and operations and really without inventing new ways of working internally, including procurement, legal contracting, partnerships, and everything that Cecilia and Laura mentioned there as well. So along with that need for kind of operational innovation, finance is also at the heart of such energy transition. We know that humanitarian funding has been increasing, but we also know that traditional public funding is not enough to cover all humanitarian needs. So back in 2017, we had a question, which in simple terms was, how can we actually meet our sustainability commitments, leveraging private capital, but also directly benefiting communities at the same time? And we had this idea together with several partners, including Energy Peace partners and some of the GPA members, that if we invest in decarbonizing our own infrastructure, it will bring concrete benefits to the people we serve, and not just in terms of air pollution reduction, but in terms of increased access to clean energy. So IOM was keen to test this idea using blended finance and really provide a proof of concept, not just for our own colleagues and senior management, but also for the whole sector. And we were very lucky to have a mission, IOM South Sudan, championing this topic and work with all of us, different management functions, to really solve the first the part of the puzzle, which was how to solarize one of our largest facilities in Malakal, which was the humanitarian hub, and how to do that with, again, a blended finance approach. So at the end, we managed to come up with a new energy procurement modality in the humanitarian sector, which is an energy supply agreement, very well known outside of the humanitarian sector, and it's based on blended finance. We basically invested some traditional donor funding and also our staff time and logistical support, but we also managed to leverage private capital through our partnership with the company that finally implemented the solarization. And based on this working solar power plant, we were eligible to certify the renewable energy credits, of course, with the help of Energy Peace partners. And we are using those funds raised through this process to solarize a community facility, which is the Malakal Teaching Hospital. These credits are really special, and really for me, they represent what humanitarian action should look like in the 21st century, in line with all of our sustainability commitments, including the Climate and Environment Charter. They not only represent the environmental attributes related to electricity generation coming from renewable energy sources, but they also represent the potential of clean energy in humanitarian and peace building actions. So we are very grateful to EPP for supporting this process from the very, very beginning, from the energy assessment all the way through. And we would love to see the PRECs really become a standard modality in the humanitarian sector. And with that, I would like to give the virtual floor to Linda for Energy Peace Partners, who will talk much more about the PRECs and also how it can be used for other organizations as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva, for that wonderful presentation. Hello, everyone. My name is Linda Wamune, and I'm Program Director for Energy Peace Partners, EPP, based in Nairobi. I will be talking about the Peace Renewable Energy Credit, which is really, I would call it one of the innovative finance mechanisms that we have developed and are promoting to help accelerate energy access in very fragile settings and more so in refugee areas. Next slide, please. Before I start, a little bit about us. We believe that renewable energy can be used as a building block for peace. And therefore, our mission, we combine a mix of, climate finance and renewable energy to be able to promote peace in the world's most fragile areas, a majority of which are in sub-Saharan Africa. And our team is comprised of, experts who are, from the peace building sector, renewable energy and climate security. My specialty is more on renewable energy. Next slide. The main challenge that we address, obviously, is very little electrification across a number of these fragile countries where we focus on. And you find that in those areas, the populations are very, the population is high. They have, other than poor access to electricity, they also have challenges with conflict. Most of the area, the ones that are highlighted in red are the countries that we focus on in sub-Saharan Africa, about 22 of them. And they're at the highest conflict risk and climate vulnerability. And considering the investment that is going into the renewable energy sector and climate financing globally, there's very little focus that is being given or placed in these countries. And so they're being left behind. They have a myriad of challenges and access to energy, which is really critical as a building block for development and peace, which we believe is not being directed in these areas. And that's really what we are trying to address. And we believe that once this is done and through partnerships, then we will be, we will be setting up these people on the ladder to increasing energy access. Next slide. Our innovation is called the Peace Renewable Energy Credit. Renewable energy credits are a form of environmental attributes, which I would call this a virtual commodity, and they are generated from renewable energy projects. So, from renewable energy sources, which could be solar, wind, hydro, geothermal. And we measure one renewable energy credit as the equivalent of 1 megawatt hour of electricity that is generated from a renewable energy source. And the peace aspect, the P comes in because we are considering these renewable energy credits that we are issuing as very special because one, they're coming from these very vulnerable, fragile countries. And we consider this as very high impact and therefore they attract a premium, hence the name, the Peace Renewable Energy Credit, because of the associated social and economic benefits that arise from the issuance of these credits. And they're targeted, they're voluntary credits, and mostly it's corporate buyers who buy these renewable energy credits in order to offset their own footprint and also to advance the impact that they're having on, for their own corporate social investment impact. So the Peace Renewable Energy Credit is issued from select, from these target countries, that the ones that I highlighted. So in as much as we are looking at all renewable energy generation, we issue from these specific countries and for projects that we deem that are really deserving of the Peace Renewable Energy Credit. And we have a process which allows you to, as a developer, you can apply, when you're in communication with us, you apply for the credits and we assess and look at how, justifiable or how the need and the benefit that would arise from the issuance of the Peace Renewable Energy Credit. And after that, now we continue with the whole process until we get a buyer. Next slide, please. In terms of the benefits of the Peace Renewable Energy Credits, there are three ways. Of course, I believe the biggest beneficiaries are the local communities who get access to energy, which they can use for a number of uses, such as improving security or improving their livelihoods, developers are able to generate additional revenues that they can use. So developers are the people that actually put up these solar projects. And companies also benefit by buying these credits, and they're able to offset their own footprints and meet their own sustainability goals that they have set. Examples, I will cite one main example, which is the Malakal project that Eva has already alluded to, and we partnered with the IOM. Next slide, please. We partnered with IOM to electrify the Malakal Teaching Hospital. So this is the beneficiary of the Peace Renewable Energy Credits, which IOM has, if I may use the word, donated, because the generation facility is not really the electrification of the hospital, but the system that they put up within the IOM to electrify the IOM facility. And they have been able to issue Peace Renewable Energy Credits from that. And those funds are being used to electrify a teaching hospital, which is also in Malakal, and is benefiting the community because now it can operate 24 hours and patients, they can run machines and basically offer better healthcare for the residents of Malakal. And so this is still ongoing, but it is the largest PREC deal so far that we have been able to close. We are seeing continued interest from a number of corporates. This one for Malakal was purchased by a technology company called Block, formerly Square, and they use this as to offset their, the footprint from the blockchain mining that they do. We have other corporate buyers that have also made purchases for PRECs in other areas. Corporates including Microsoft, who have partnered with some developers in the DRC. We have Google that has also done the same. And we have had a couple of other transactions that are lined up, which we are still negotiating on behalf of the beneficiaries. So that is it in a nutshell. And I'm going to drop on the link here, just some information, more information, and the press release for the Malakal transaction that happened, was released last month. So you can take a look at that for more information. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Eva and Linda. Really appreciate the overview of the project work in Malakal. Really, really important things. Well, great, thank you. Now we're going to the discussion time. We're slightly behind, so I will jump into the chat. I see some of the questions have been answered, so I won't look at those, but let me just run through, see if we've got some questions. The first question from Rebecca Solis, WFP, has been responded to by Cecilia in the chat. So great, thank you, Cecilia. She's also responded to Amy Jenks. So please, if you're interested in some of the comments, the work that Mercy Corps is doing, please do have a look back at those. Laura, there's a question from you on, I'm going to just check. Did you respond to that one? Yeah, Laura, there's a question from Amy that asks, sorry, I'm getting lost. Yep, question here from Henry Boss, actually, to Laura. Assuming that the camp setting in Rwanda is transformational, transitional, how did this relate to your experiences on Project Demand? I actually think you've answered that one in the chat as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, I've tried to answer that one in the chat. So yeah,
okay.
happy to, if there's any follow-up questions.
No, great. Another one from Megan Cocker to Laura. I may have missed this, or maybe it was part of the larger program, but did the work on the solar and electricity include local host communities in addition to the refugee population? Does this influence the readiness of the market companies to have more confidence to invest in the refugee camps?
Yeah, so I didn't include that component in the presentation today, but it was a key component, and the two suppliers that we worked with, and as we went through the application selection process, the suppliers that we were engaging with had quite different profiles in the host community and proposed quite different options depending on what their existing profile was in the host community about how they could extend their operations into the camps. Yeah, it was included. So we shared at the start of the project, we did a very detailed assessment to make sure that we understood what the market was like in the camps. And we shared that information with the potential suppliers through the application process. But we also wanted to understand, when we went through the selection process, what the existing profile of the suppliers was in the host community and what they would really need to be able to either extend their operations into the camp or even have a different offering that would be more suitable for refugees. So it was quite individual for each of those suppliers. They had quite a different approach to what they might need to adapt or change, or whether they would just want to keep their same kind of way of operating, but just extend it into the camps. And I would say it very much did influence the readiness of those companies to have the confidence to invest in those camps. So it very much depended on what their existing physical presence was in the local host community. For example, Bbox have got a very technology-driven remote monitoring offering, which doesn't necessarily rely on a physical presence in the same way. So it very much affected their readiness, but also which elements of their business model they needed co-financing or supporting or de-risking. So it was very individual for each supplier.
Great, thanks, Laura. Sticking with you, come back to Amy's question because it actually reflects on the suppliers. So, and she asked, can you share about challenges or learnings from selecting suppliers? What kind of mindset shift or business model shift would you see needed for companies to be able to engage on a more commercial basis?
Yeah, so again, I think we saw quite different approaches from the two suppliers that we engaged with, but one of the key components was really demystifying the camp setting, taking some time both early on in the process and throughout to really help those private sector suppliers, and particularly thinking about what happens when practical action finish and our involvement finishes, getting them to understand the camp, how the camp works. For example, in the camps in Rwanda, you have to have specific permissions to access the camp, making sure that the private sector suppliers have the capacity to be able to get their own access, to talk to the camp managers, to talk to refugee representatives, to have the capacity to work and adapt to refugees as customers compared to host community as customers. So I think demystifying, sharing information, building capacity to be able to support customers in the camps and be able to be adaptable to some of the particularities of the refugee customer base, and also really trying to get that long-term vision about what the companies would see their business looking like in the camp, specifically in 1, 2, maybe 3, even longer years. That's particularly important because one of the strategies to be able to address affordability is to have these extended pay-as-you-go or extended repayment periods. So you're really talking about quite a long-term commitment and making sure that your conversations and your engagement with the private sector suppliers are focusing on that long-term sustainable business model is a real key component of the engagement with those suppliers.
Great. I got one more question and I'll give you a little bit of a breather. In your presentation, you had 79% of customers were paying on time. I assume that means to the solar home systems. Jonathan asks in the chat, what was the sort of default rate? Did you, and
yeah.
additional question from me, how did that compare to normal default rates in the similar market, similar market space?
Yeah, so 79% was people on time. The remainder of that is a mixture of people who are either late or have had their systems repossessed. So with both of the suppliers, we have a sort of definition of customer management as to how they manage people being active customers, how they manage them as being late payments, and each of those suppliers has a different process for managing late payments. And when they transition them to being defaulters, and then when they transition them to, in some cases, unfortunately, having to repossess those solar home systems. And in some cases, that's a repossession kind of by mutual agreement. Sometimes customers say, well, you know, I don't want to pay for this anymore, and I want to effectively return my system to them. And in some cases, it's more about, well, you know, this is you're a repeat late payment, and it gets to the point where it can't be resolved. They can't adapt the payment model anymore, and in some cases some systems have been repossessed. I don't know specifically for Bellicom, because they have a slightly different offering for the host community, but for Bbox, for that smaller system, it's comparable with the host community in terms of default rates. I think the main difference is, though, we subsidize this upfront period, so we're only just coming to the end of that 3-year period. So it'll be interesting to see whether that changes over the longer term once the sort of subsidized element that we've been reducing that initial cost for finishes. So, but for Bbox, it was comparable with the host community.
Great, thanks, Laura. I'll give you a bit of a breather. There is a couple more questions that we get to, and we'll come back to that. So I'm going to hand over to some questions to Linda. So there's a couple of questions here, not necessarily going to do in order. I think there's a different flow here. So the first question is, what's the difference between a PREC and carbon credits?
Well, I would give an analogy that they are similar yet very different, like two sides of a coin. Renewable energy credits usually measure electricity generation from a renewable energy source. So it is looking at the generation element of, you know, specifically electricity from a renewable energy source, which could be solar, wind, or whatever. And they're used to validate the consumption and, you know, the renewableness of that project, and therefore it's sort of like a reward. On the other hand, a carbon credit is measured in terms of tons of CO2, carbon dioxide emissions emitted, and they represent the reduction or the avoidance of the greenhouse gases that would be emitted from, you know, a project. So while RECs are looking at the electricity generation and, you know, counting that in terms of megawatt hours. So one renewable energy credit is the equivalent of 1 megawatt hour of electricity generated. A carbon credit, carbon offset, looks at how much carbon have you avoided emitting. And we look at, you know, it is measured in terms of the tons of carbon dioxide emissions that have been avoided. So, you know, and you cannot account from the same project, you cannot count RECs and carbon credits from the same project. So if it's a project that is issuing RECs, it is just RECs. If it is a project that is looking at carbon credits or offsets, then it is just that. So you cannot do both from.
Great, thanks. It's a follow-up question. William Poppert, asks, what is the annual payment for each megawatt hour credit?
There is no fixed payment, but we look at a range of between 10 to 50. So it all depends on the contracts that we have and the discussions and you know, who the buyer is and how many RECs are on offer. So current, but the target pricing is 10 to 50.
Okay, Linda, following up that, I have my sort of own question. What sort of premium do you get on the PRECs? If you're, you know, I mean, there must be interest from, you know, private sector partners that are looking to not only purchase credits, but also to have some kudos with some of these really exciting projects in really challenging environments. So what sort of uplifting cost do you see associated with that?
For the corporates is really them all playing their part in terms of increasing energy access, especially to these overlooked countries and projects and settings. So most of them look at it from a corporate sustainability lens, and therefore, you know, helping just make, playing their part in increasing access to this very least favored settings.
Thanks, Linda. Coming back to Laura's question here from Harriet. What is the process for assessing individuals' affordability before giving them a solar system on a loan, assuming that the majority do not have formal credit ratings?
So,
for Laura.
Yeah, so the two suppliers that we worked with had a slightly different payment model. So Bbox basically asks people to pay, is a pay-as-you-go system. So you pay every month, and every month that you pay, you're guaranteed a sort of energy service provision from their system. So you're effectively paying for the electricity, you're effectively paying for the service rather than paying for a solar home system on a loan scheme. For Bellicom, it's slightly different. They pay every month up until a period, over an extended period, usually 3 months, usually 3 years, until they own that solar home system. And at that point, they basically paid for the solar home system in full. But during that period, for both Bbox and Bellicom, they also provide after-sales services in terms of technical support, customer support, user training, all those other things that people would need to keep their solar home system functioning. Both of the suppliers have sort of mechanisms, as I mentioned, for managing late payments and defaults, and have been quite flexible in terms of adapting and giving grace periods, and particularly during things like COVID, when the camps were in lockdown, have sort of been particularly adaptable when people couldn't leave the camps, or when they couldn't, household budgets were particularly strained, have been quite flexible and adaptable to that. So really, we're making sure that we're focusing on trying to be adaptable and making those financial mechanisms as adaptable as possible for the refugee community. And in some cases, people simply decide they don't want to pay for their system anymore, actually, and particularly with the Bbox model, that's very much how their model is structured. It's a pay-as-you-go kind of system. So yeah, not everybody completes their payment up until the end.
Great, thanks Laura. I see there's actually a couple of e-waste questions, what happens around batteries, recycling and disposal in the community. Elif, if you're still on the call, can you just drop a link to the NORCAP GPA report on e-waste, which discusses this. It's sort of much more general approach to managing that process. So if you do have an interest in e-waste, please do look at that. I'm wondering if any of the panelists wish to pick up that question, or happy to leave it to the report on a much general report. Or Cecilia, Laura, anything specific you'd like to say about e-waste on your projects, or would you just defer to the report?
I think your report is quite comprehensive, Mark. Yeah. Okay,
great. Laura?
Yeah, I would say we asked both of the suppliers that we engaged with, or all of the applicants, to tell us what their end-of-life waste management project was, and they talked about the sort of local facilities that are available. Bbox in particular, as long as you keep paying their subscription fee, will swap out your deep broken components and kind of manage it through their reverse supply chain effectively. As it stands, the first solar home systems that were sold were probably installed maybe 2.5–3 years ago. So we would expect them to last for a bit longer than that. So we're not quite there yet in terms of managing that end of life piece, but there was a plan. We'll have to see whether that comes into reality at the end, but we certainly have made provision that is managed and that there is a plan in place for that. What I can't tell you is if that's actually happened for real, because we're not quite at the end of life yet. But certainly in terms of managing component parts, both the suppliers are kind of doing technical support to change out faulty components and putting them through their reverse supply chain.
Okay, excellent. We have 1 minute left, and I see Elizabeth, you just dropped a little link in there about issues around low income, and I've seen the report. It's very interesting. Unfortunately, we don't have time to look at that, but I think what we're seeing here is two very different approaches, where the Bloomberg report really looks at the business approach of just selling systems. And what we're looking at from this point of view from humanitarian settings is that we're sort of governed by protection concerns, making sure that the end users is protected from these sort of things, understanding the affordability, understanding how we can deliver sustainable solutions and minimizing e-waste. So I would say it's a slightly different marketplace and a very different approach to how we're doing that. So although it's a very interesting report and there is some lessons for us to learn from there, I don't think it's to the same level, but we need to be aware of these, because we could run the risk of programs being designed inappropriately, where affordability and sort of long-term sign up to these contracts can cause problems. So thank you for raising that. And if anyone hasn't read the report, please do so. It's quite an interesting read. With that, we are out of time. So thank you, speakers, for your very interesting presentations, and thank you, colleagues, to taking time out of your day to listen to these presentations. We've seen some really excellent examples today on sort of blended finance and market-based approaches. And if there is interest in sort of taking these forward, because we want to see transformative change at scale, please do reach out to us and we can connect you to the right people to see how we can, revisit these projects and move them in different contexts. So thank you again, everyone. Really appreciate it. And as you've seen in the link there, please join us in a couple of weeks' time at the Humanitarian Energy Conference. So thanks again, everyone. Take care and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.